April 28, 1503. A dust-choked ridge in southern Italy. You are a Spanish arquebusier, and your hands are shaking. It isn't the morning chill, the Mediterranean sun is already high, baking the hills of Apulia into a scorched yellow. It is a low, rhythmic thrumming vibrating through the soles of your boots, the kind of sound a mountain makes just before it collapses. It is the sound of 12,000 French boots and 4,000 heavy warhorses closing the distance. You look down at your weapon, a heavy, crude iron pipe lashed to a wooden stock. It is slow. It is temperamental. It is prone to clogging, cracking, and failing when you need it most. And right now, it is the only thing standing between you and the most feared heavy cavalry in the known world. For centuries, the rules of the world have been simple: if you are a foot soldier and you see the French heavy cavalry charging toward you, you die. There is no middle ground. You are either crushed under hoof, run through by a 12-foot ash lance, or you flee and are cut down from behind. The Knights of France, the Gendarmes, are not just soldiers. They are a force of nature. They are the apex predators of the medieval food chain, encased in steel that reflects the sun like a warning from God himself. They represent 1,000 years of noble dominance, a caste of warriors who have never known a peer on the open field. Then, the world ends. A roar, louder than any French cannon, rips through the Spanish lines. A shockwave throws you flat into the dirt, knocking the wind from your lungs. Your ears ring with a high, piercing whine that drowns out the screams of your comrades. When you finally pull yourself up, gasping for air and coughing on thick, sulphurous smoke, you see the catastrophe. The Spanish gunpowder wagons, the literal lifeblood of your defense, have vanished. In their place is a massive column of flame and debris reaching toward the heavens. A spark from a careless match, or perhaps a freak accident in the sweltering heat, has just erased your army's primary advantage. The black powder meant to break the French charge is gone. In an instant, the iron discipline of the Spanish infantry begins to fail. These are men who have fought through the Reconquista, men who are used to hardship, but this feels like a divine sentence. Men around you are shouting that the heavens have cursed the campaign. They look at the horizon, where the glint of French steel is getting brighter by the second, and they see certain death. Without that powder, your arquebus is just a heavy, useless club. Without that powder, the French will not even slow down. They will ride over this ridge and turn the Spanish army into a memory. You can see the fear spreading like a contagion. It starts in the eyes of the young recruits and moves to the veterans. The line begins to waver. Footmen begin to look over their shoulders, calculating the distance to the rear, wondering if they can outrun the inevitable. The collective pulse of 5,000 men is racing toward a breaking point. But then, a horse maneuvers through the chaos. Gonzalo de Córdoba, the man history will remember as El Gran Capitán, the great captain, rides directly toward the burning wreckage. He does not look afraid. He does not look like a man who just lost his only chance at survival. He looks at the towering flames, the thick smoke blotting out the sun, and then he turns to his terrified men with a grin that defies every law of logic. "Behold, my friends," his voice booms, carrying over the crackle of the fire and the moans of the injured. "These are the luminarias of our victory. God has lit the victory bonfires early because he knows the glory that awaits us today. Why should we need powder when we have already won the favor of the Almighty?" It is a lie. A desperate, magnificent, brazen lie. Gonzalo knows the powder is gone. He knows his men are outnumbered. He knows the French Duke of Nemours is minutes away from launching a hammer blow designed to crush the Spanish force into the mud. He knows that, by every metric of 16th-century warfare, he should be retreating. He is standing on the edge of a total military collapse, watching his supplies burn in front of the most lethal army in Europe. But his words work. The panic halts. The men look at the fire, then back at their commander. If he isn't running, why should they? If he sees a celebration in the flames, perhaps they should too. 6,000 Spanish souls pivot back to the earthworks they have spent all morning digging. They grip their pikes with renewed strength. They blow on their matches, hoping for a lingering spark in the ash. They choose to believe in the man who turned a disaster into a celebration. This is the Battle of Cerignola. It is not just another clash for Italian soil. It is the precise moment the Middle Ages died and the modern world was born. It is the day the armored knight, the undisputed king of the battlefield for 1,000 years, ran headfirst into the cold, calculating reality of the trench and the bullet. It is the day the world learned that a ditch and a peasant with a gun could dismantle an empire of nobility. It is the moment where the warrior began to be replaced by the soldier, and where raw courage began to fall before industrial efficiency. The French are coming with tradition, with high-born blood, and with an overwhelming force that has never been truly broken. The Spanish are waiting with shovels, lead, and a general who values results over ritual. The French believe in the glory of the charge, the Spanish believe in the geometry of the kill. The French see a field of honor, the Spanish see a killing zone. Before we witness the collision that ended an era, I want to humbly ask for your support. This channel is dedicated to the grit, the strategy, and the raw human decisions that changed the course of history. We spend hundreds of hours researching these pivotal moments to bring them to life with the substance they deserve. If you value this level of detail and want to support stories of resilience and innovation, please like this video and leave a comment below. It is the most effective way to help this story reach more people who value history, and it truly helps our channel grow. Your engagement tells the world that there is still an audience for deep, meaningful historical storytelling. The smoke from the explosion is finally starting to drift away, revealing the terrifying reality of the valley below. The French lances are dipping into their rests, a forest of sharpened wood pointing directly at your chest. The thrumming in the ground has become a roar. The French Duke has seen the explosion, and he thinks it is a sign of Spanish weakness. He thinks the hunt is over. He believes the Spanish are in disarray, broken by their own incompetence. He is about to order the charge that will change Europe forever. But he hasn't seen the trench. He hasn't seen the stakes driven into the dirt. And he hasn't realized that the man leading the Spanish doesn't play by the rules of knights and kings. Let's go back to the ridge. Let's look at the men who refused to run when the world caught fire. Let's look at how 5,000 Spaniards prepared to face 12,000 of the finest warriors in existence with nothing but a ditch and a dream of a new kind of war. To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand the monster that was currently galloping toward the Spanish lines. You have to understand that, in 1503, the French army wasn't just a military force, it was a statement of divine right. They were the gendarmes, and they were about to find out that the world had changed while they were busy polishing their armor. To understand the sheer terror of standing on that ridge at Cerignola, you have to look past the dust and the smoke. You have to look at the men descending upon the Spanish lines. These were not mere conscripts or mercenaries hired for a season's campaign. These were the gendarmes of France, the heavy cavalry of the king, and the most lethal military institution in the Western world. For over a millennium, the heavy horsemen had dictated the terms of human existence. From the fall of Rome to the dawn of the 16th century, the equation of power was simple: he who possessed the horse and the armor possessed the land. The gendarmes were the final, perfected evolution of this ancient tradition. They were a closed caste of nobility, men who had been bred, fed, and trained since childhood for the singular purpose of the charge. To them, war was not a science of logistics or a riddle of engineering. It was a divine pageant. It was an opportunity to manifest their social superiority through physical dominance. A single French gendarme was a fortress in motion. He was encased from crown to toe in articulated steel, a masterpiece of metallurgical craft designed to deflect arrows, slide blades, and absorb the impact of a mace. The cost of a single suit of this, white armor, could rival the annual tax revenue of a small town. It was more than protection, it was a physical manifestation of his right to rule. Beneath him was a destrier, a warhorse bred for aggression and mass, itself often protected by steel plates. These animals were trained to bite, kick, and trample anything in their path. When 1,000 of these men moved in unison, they didn't just attack an army, they erased it. Their method was the shock, a concentrated, galloping wall of iron that used kinetic energy to shatter enemy formations like glass. For generations, no infantry on Earth had successfully stood before that momentum. The very sight of them was usually enough to trigger a rout before the first lance even touched a breastplate. This brings us to the myth of invincibility. In 1503, the French High Command believed that heavy armor and horse flesh were the only metrics of power that mattered. This wasn't just arrogance, it was a deeply ingrained worldview. They looked at the history of the last few centuries and saw a consistent truth: the noble, on horseback, always triumphed over the commoner, on foot. To the French aristocracy, the idea that a peasant with a shovel or a crude gunpowder tube could dictate the outcome of a battle was not just unlikely, it was offensive. It violated the natural order of the world. They saw the common soldier as a mere backdrop to the real conflict, which was always a duel between elites. They viewed war as an extension of the tournament. It was about valor, lineage, and the d'élan, that spirit of irresistible French fire. They believed that if you charged hard enough and with enough conviction, the reality of the terrain and the technology of the enemy would simply bend to your will. This was the fatal flaw of the medieval mind, the belief that will outweighed physics. They ignored the growing evidence that the world was changing. They dismissed the rise of professional infantry and the increasing lethality of small arms as dishonorable gimmicks that would never survive a real clash of men. To Nemours and his peers, the firearm was a cowardly invention that stripped the glory from combat. They believed that no man of true breeding would fall to a lead ball fired by a starving farmer. At the center of this archaic mindset was Louis d'Armagnac, the Duke of Nemours. Nemours was the quintessential hero of the Old World. He was young, handsome, immensely wealthy, and possessed by a romanticized vision of conflict. To him, the Italian wars were a stage upon which he could earn immortal fame. He was not a strategist in the sense that we understand the word today. He did not care for the squalid details of supply lines, terrain analysis, or defensive fortifications. He cared for the moment of impact. He cared for the glory of the vanguard. He was a man who believed that the loudest horn and the brightest banner were the most important tools of command. When Nemours looked toward the Spanish position at Cerignola, he didn't see a defensive masterpiece. He saw a collection of vermin hiding behind dirt. His scouts brought him reports of a ditch being dug along the ridge. They warned him that the Spanish were fortifying their position with stakes and earthworks. A modern general would have paused. A modern leader would have waited for his heavy artillery, which was still miles behind on the muddy roads, to arrive and blast those defenses into dust. The French had some of the best cannons in the world, capable of turning the Spanish mounds into a flat graveyard. But Nemours was not a modern leader. He was a prisoner of his own status. To the Duke, waiting for cannons was a mark of hesitation. To maneuver around the flank was a sign of fear. His peers were watching. His king was watching. The ethos of the French nobility demanded a direct assault. He saw the Spanish trench as a minor inconvenience, a pathetic obstacle that would be cleared by the sheer weight of his horses. He believed that the divine fire of his knights would carry them over any furrow in the ground. He mocked the idea that his gendarmes could be stopped by a simple drainage ditch. To him, war was about the horizontal rush, not the vertical obstacle. There is a specific kind of blindness that comes with absolute dominance. The French had been the masters of the battlefield for so long that they had forgotten how to learn. They were victims of their own success. While Gonzalo de Córdoba, the iron mind of Spain, was obsessively studying his past failures and looking for ways to innovate, Nemours was busy polishing a legacy that was already starting to rust. The French military machine was a monolith, powerful, but rigid. It could not conceive of a world where it was not the center of gravity. The Duke's hubris was not just personal, it was systemic. The entire French officer corps shared this disdain for the defensive. They viewed the spade as a tool for laborers, not warriors. They believed that the great captain of Spain was acting like a coward by refusing to meet them in an open, fair melee. This moral judgment clouded their tactical judgment. They interpreted Gonzalo's caution as frailty. They saw his reliance on the arquebus as a sign that his men were too weak to fight with real weapons like the sword and lance. They believed the Spanish were afraid to look them in the eye. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky on that April afternoon, the pressure on Nemours mounted. His troops were tired and hungry from a long march. His supply train was lagging. He had two choices: he could wait until the next morning, allowing his men to rest and his heavy guns to catch up, or he could strike immediately to catch the Spanish before they could retreat. He feared that if he didn't attack now, the Spanish would slip away in the dark, denying him the decisive victory he craved. His viziers and seasoned captains suggested the former. They saw the strength of the Spanish position. They felt the unease of the terrain. They noticed that the ridge was steeper than it looked from a distance. But Nemours could not bear the thought of the Spanish escaping. He perceived any delay as a stain on his honor. He decided that the sun would not set until the Spanish flags were trampled in the dirt. He wanted a victory that was fast, spectacular, and undeniably French. He signaled his elites to prepare for the surge. These were the titans of the Renaissance, men who had crushed every foe from the plains of Italy to the forests of the north. They arrayed themselves in massive wedges, their colorful pennants of lapis, crimson, and gold fluttering in the breeze. The sound of their armor clanking was like the heartbeat of an iron giant. It was a spectacle of absolute splendor. From a distance, it looked like the inexorable victory of heritage and tradition. The gendarmes lowered their visors. The world through those narrow slits became a tunnel of steel and focused aggression. They didn't see the Spanish soldiers as humans, they saw them as obstacles to be removed. They didn't see the trench as a grave, they saw it as a hurdle. The Duke himself felt the rush of adrenaline that comes from the certainty of triumph. He was the high sovereign of this moment, the master of the field. Nemours placed himself at the very front of the right flank. He wanted the inaugural blood. He wanted to be the first to breach the Spanish line and take Gonzalo's head. He spurred his mount, and the mass of 4,000 horses began to move. First a trot, then a canter. The ground began to moan under the weight. The unstoppable wall was finally in motion, and it was heading straight for a man who had spent his entire life learning how to break it. This was the collision of two different timelines. Nemours was riding out of the 12th century, while Gonzalo was waiting in the 16th. The gendarmes were the peak of what war used to be. They were about to find out what war was becoming. As they gathered speed, they were not just charging an army, they were charging into the end of their own history. As the distance closed, the French knights felt a surge of familiar confidence. They had done this 100 times before. They had seen infantry lines waver and break long before the impact. They expected the Spanish to fire one disorganized volley and then flee in terror as the iron wall arrived. They were so assured in their dominance that they didn't even notice the specific geometry of the ridge they were ascending. They didn't notice that the slope was funneling them into a narrow, concentrated space, stripping away their ability to maneuver. They were galloping into a trap designed by a man who had stripped away the romance of war and replaced it with the cold arithmetic of death. Nemours, resplendent in his gilded armor and ostrich plumes, was leading the most expensive, most highly trained military force in history into a ditch. To him, the Spanish were a puzzle he had already solved. He didn't realize that Gonzalo had changed the rules of the game while the French weren't looking. The French elite were about to enter a slaughter pen, not a battlefield. They were about to be demoted from the masters of the world to the victims of a new, industrial form of slaughter. The thrumming of the hooves had now become a deafening roar that shook the very air. The dust kicked up by the charge obscured the Spanish lines, making it look as though they had already vanished. Nemours leaned forward in his saddle, his lance leveled, his heart pounding with the thrill of the hunt. He was seconds away from impact. He was seconds away from the glory he had craved his entire life. And then, he saw the depth of the furrow. He saw the sharp stakes glinting in the dirt. He realized, far too late, that the Spanish hadn't been digging a ditch. They had been building an altar of earth and lead, and the French were the sacrifice. To understand the victory at Cerignola, you have to look at the man standing on the other side of that ditch. While the Duke of Nemours represented the sunset of the Middle Ages, Gonzalo de Córdoba was the dawn of a new era. Known to history as El Gran Capitán, the Great Captain, Gonzalo was not born with this title. He earned it through the most painful teacher a commander can have: total, humiliating defeat. 7 years before the dust of Cerignola, in 1495, Gonzalo faced the French at the Battle of Cerignola. At the time, he was a rising star of the Spanish crown, fresh from the successes of the Reconquista. He followed the traditional Spanish playbook of the era: light, mobile cavalry and loosely organized infantry. He fought with honor and tradition. The result was a catastrophe. The French Gendarmes didn't just beat his army, they pulverized it. Gonzalo watched as his lines were shredded by the sheer mass of the French charge. He survived only because a loyal subordinate gave up his horse so the general could escape. This moment of failure was the seed of his genius. He realized that the era of the noble knight could not be beaten by imitation or raw bravery. It had to be beaten by a system. He spent the years following Cerignola dissecting his failure with the precision of a surgeon. He looked at the Swiss pikemen, the Italian mercenaries, and the emerging technology of gunpowder. He realized that to defeat a force that relied on momentum, you had to remove the ability to move. You had to turn the battlefield into an obstacle course. This transformation from a traditional knight to a master of integrated warfare is what led him to the ridge at Cerignola. By April 1503, Gonzalo was no longer just a general, he was an architect. He had discarded the romantic notions of the valiant melee and replaced them with a cold, analytical approach to slaughter. He became obsessed with the mechanics of the defense, realizing that a man who doesn't move is a man who doesn't tire. He began to retrain his men not just in how to fight, but in how to think of themselves as parts of a larger machine. When the Spanish arrived at the heights of Cerignola on that fateful morning, Gonzalo didn't tell his men to sharpen their swords. He told them to pick up spades. This was a radical departure from the military norms of the time. To the aristocratic French, digging in the dirt was the work of mules and serfs. To Gonzalo, the spade was a weapon of war every bit as lethal as the lance. It was a tool that allowed a weaker force to equalize the physics of the battlefield. He surveyed the terrain with a cold, mathematical eye. He didn't choose the flattest ground for a fair fight. He chose a vineyard-covered hill that naturally restricted the movement of horses. Then, he began to engineer the environment. For hours, as the French were marching toward them, the Spanish army was working. They weren't just digging a hole, they were crafting a kill zone. They excavated a deep, wide trench, a fosso, running the length of their front. The dirt from that trench wasn't hauled away, it was piled up behind the gap to create a steep earthen rampart, or terraplen. Imagine the scene: 5,000 men, from the lowest foot soldier to the seasoned officers, sweating under the Italian sun, moving tons of earth. They were building a fortress in the middle of an open field. Gonzalo moved among them, not as a distant lord, but as a foreman. He understood that the quality of the trench would dictate the survival of his men. He ensured the trench was deep enough that a horse could not leap it without losing all its speed, and the bank was high enough to protect his gunners from enemy fire. The labor was grueling. It was unglamorous. It was the antithesis of the glittering war Nemours was planning. But every shovelful of dirt was a nail in the coffin of the French cavalry. By noon, the Spanish had effectively rewritten the geography of the ridge. They had created a vertical barrier in a world that only understood horizontal movement. This ditch was the anchor of Gonzalo's plan. He knew the French would see the hill and the dirt and feel a sense of disdain. He counted on their pride to drive them directly into the mouth of the trap. He wasn't standing his ground, he was forcing the French to fight on his ground, under his conditions. He was using the earth itself to strip the French of their greatest asset, their speed. Without speed, a knight is just a heavy target. But the trench was only half of the puzzle. The true genius of Gonzalo de Córdoba lay in how he populated that line. He was the first to master what we now call integrated warfare. He looked at his army not as a collection of warriors, but as a series of interlocking components. In the medieval world, units were usually homogeneous. You had a block of knights, a block of archers, and perhaps a block of spearmen. They rarely worked in tight coordination. Gonzalo changed that. He created a tiered defensive system that utilized every weapon to its maximum potential. At the very front of the line, perched right behind the earthen mound, he placed his arquebusiers. These were the men with the guns. In any other army, they would have been skirmishers, firing once and then running away. Here, they were the primary killers. The mound protected their bodies, leaving only their heads and the barrels of their guns exposed. This gave them the psychological stability to aim and reload while 4,000 horses were thundering toward them. They weren't exposed in the open, they were ensconced in a bunker of soil. They were given the luxury of focus, something rarely afforded to a foot soldier in the face of a cavalry charge. Directly behind the gunners, Gonzalo stationed his pikemen. These men carried ash poles 16 feet long, tipped with steel. Their job was to act as the iron wall. If any French knight managed to survive the gunshots and scramble through the ditch, he would find himself face to face with a forest of steel points that he could not bypass. The pikemen provided the stability, while the gunners provided the lethality. This synergy meant that the weakness of one unit was covered by the strength of another. The gunner was vulnerable while reloading, so the pikeman stood over him. The pikeman was vulnerable at long range, so the gunner cleared the field before him. Finally, hidden in the gaps and behind the main line, Gonzalo placed his rodoleros, shield-bearers armed with short swords. These were his clean-up crews. If the French charge stalled in the ditch, these men were trained to slide down into the muck and finish the grounded knights through the gaps in their armor. They were the serrated edge of his machine, designed for the dirty, close-quarter work that follows a failed assault. This was the integrated line. It was a machine designed to absorb the greatest force in Europe and grind it into nothing. It was the birth of the colonella, the precursor to the legendary Spanish tercio that would dominate Europe for a century. Gonzalo had essentially created a mobile fortress, a system that could be deployed on any field to nullify the power of the elite. Gonzalo's men weren't fighting as individuals seeking glory. They were fighting as cogs in a lethal apparatus. Every man had a specific role, a specific square of dirt to defend, and a specific sequence of actions to follow. While the French relied on the individual prowess of their nobles, the Spanish relied on the collective efficiency of their system. This was the democratization of death. It didn't matter if the Spanish soldier was of low birth. Behind that mound, with his pike or his gun, he was part of a formation that could kill a king. As the afternoon shadows grew long, Gonzalo walked the line one last time. He checked the depth of the ditch. He ensured the gunners had enough lead and that their matches were dry. He looked at the faces of his men, men who had been transformed from a defeated rabble into the world's first modern infantry. He had given them more than just a trench, he had given them a way to win. He spoke to them not of family honor or divine mandates, but of discipline and staying in formation. He reminded them that as long as they held the line, the ridge was theirs. He knew that the French Duke of Nemours would see this as a cowardly way to fight. He knew that the chronicles of the time would call it a dirty victory. But Gonzalo de Córdoba didn't care about the songs the poets would sing. He cared about the men who would go home to Spain. He cared about the cold, hard fact of survival. He was a man who had seen the old world fail at Seminara, and he was determined that the new world would succeed here. He stood at the center of his line, looking out at the shimmering heat haze where the French were beginning to form their ranks. He could see the colorful banners. He could hear the distant blare of the trumpets. He knew that the most expensive, most elite military force in the world was about to run headfirst into a pile of dirt. He watched as the French wedges expanded, their lances gleaming. They looked magnificent, like a relic from a storybook. But Gonzalo wasn't looking at their banners, he was looking at the ground between them and his ditch. The great captain took his position. He didn't draw a sword for a heroic duel. He simply waited for the geometry to do its work. He had built a grave for the Middle Ages, and he was just waiting for the French to climb inside. He had calculated the distance, the speed of the charge, and the reload time of his guns. He had turned war into an equation. The strategy was set. The tools were in place. The spade had done its job, now it was time for the lead. The Spanish soldiers stood behind their mounds, silent, watching the steel wall begin its final approach. They were no longer afraid. They were prepared. They were the heirs of the great captain's vision. This wasn't just a battle. It was a demonstration. Gonzalo was about to show the world that the age of the warrior was over, and the age of the engineer had begun. The gendarmes were coming, confident in their armor and their ancestors. But they were about to find out that a ditch dug with purpose is stronger than 1,000 years of noble tradition. The era of the shock was about to meet the era of the wall. The ground began to vibrate. The first French wedges were beginning their trot. On the ridge, the Spanish gunners blew on their matches, the tiny orange glows signaling the end of an era. The architect of the trench stood ready. He had rewritten the rules of the game. Now, he just had to watch the French try to play by the old ones. The trap was set, and the world was about to change. To understand why the ground beneath the French nobility was about to give way, you have to understand the device clutched in the calloused hands of the Spanish infantry. It was called the arquebus. By the standards of modern weaponry, it was a clumsy, temperamental, and profoundly dangerous piece of hardware. But on the ridge of Cerignola, it was the scythe of the future. It was a tool that did not just kill men, it killed the concept of the warrior as the world had known it for 1,000 years. The arquebus was a matchlock firearm, a long, heavy iron tube fixed to a rough-hewn wooden stock. To fire it, a soldier didn't simply pull a trigger and hear a click. The process was a slow, mechanical choreography that required steady nerves and a total lack of distraction. The soldier carried a match, a length of hemp cord soaked in potassium nitrate to keep it burning at a slow, constant smolder. This cord was his lifeline and his greatest danger. To prime the weapon, he had to pour a measured amount of coarse black powder into a small pan on the side of the barrel. Then, he would pull a lever, which lowered the glowing tip of the match into the powder. The resulting explosion was not the clean, sharp crack of a modern rifle. It was a violent, earth-shaking eruption of flame and thick, choking smoke. The arquebus was smelly, spitting out the stench of sulfur and burnt chemicals. It was wildly inaccurate. At 50 paces, you were lucky to hit a specific man. It was slow. A skilled man could perhaps get off 2 shots a minute if his hands weren't shaking too badly. But the physics were undeniable. The lead ball, heavy and soft, carried enough kinetic energy to ignore the protections of the past. It was a mechanical reaper, and it was about to be unleashed on a massive scale. Think about the physics of the night. For a millennium, the only way to kill a man in full plate armor was to find a tiny gap, the visor, the armpit, or the joints, and drive a blade through it. This required immense strength, years of training, and the courage to get within inches of a man who was trying to do the same to you. The armor was a physical barrier that separated the highborn from the consequences of war. A duke in his steel shell was effectively a god among men. His armor was his castle, a portable fortification that made him nearly invulnerable to the lowly weapons of the foot soldier. To the French, the battlefield was a place where armor was the ultimate law. But the arquebus didn't care about lineage. It didn't care about the quality of the steel or the bravery of the man wearing it. When a lead ball, weighing nearly an ounce, is propelled by an explosion at close range. It possesses a force that no medieval armor can withstand. It doesn't slide off the curved surface of a breastplate, it bites. It crumples the steel. It drives shards of metal and padding into the flesh beneath. It turns the knight's own protection into shrapnel. At Cerignola, this led to the democratization of death. This is the most profound shift in the history of human conflict. Before this moment, the kill was a matter of individual skill and social rank. It took 20 years to train a French gendarme. You had to feed him the finest meats, provide him with the best horses, and school him in the complex arts of the lance and the sword. He was an investment of hundreds of thousands of gold coins. He was a human Ferrari, expensive, fragile in his own way, and irreplaceable once destroyed. A Spanish arquebusier, by contrast, was a peasant. He might have been a starving farmer or a city laborer just weeks before the battle. With 2 weeks of drill, he could be taught how to load the powder, ram the ball, and blow on the match. He cost the Spanish crown almost nothing. And yet, that peasant, standing behind a pile of dirt, could pull a lever and instantly erase the 20 years of training and the massive financial investment of the French duke. This was warfare turning into an industry. It was the moment where quantity and mechanical efficiency began to outweigh individual quality. The French looked at the arquebus and saw something: cheating. They saw a weapon that allowed a coward to kill a hero from a distance. They saw it as a violation of the laws of nature. In their minds, a man's worth on the battlefield should be determined by his heart and his heritage, not by a tube of iron and a bag of foul-smelling powder. They believed that war should be a contest of wills, not a contest of chemistry. This technological shift didn't just threaten their lives, it threatened their very identity as a ruling class. If a commoner could kill a lord with a pull of a lever, why should the lord rule? There are accounts from this era of captured gunners being executed on the spot by knights who viewed their weapons as a form of sorcery or a moral abomination. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that their social superiors could be snuffed out by someone who had never held a title. This wasn't just a military disagreement, it was a class war. The knight represented the feudal order, stable, hierarchical, and slow-moving. The arquebusier represented the modern state, mass-produced, professional, and ruthless. The arquebus was the tool of the future state, a weapon that prioritized the result over the process. Gonzalo de Córdoba, however, did not care about the honor of the kill. He was a man of the Renaissance, a time when the old myths were being dismantled by observation and reason. He saw that the world didn't run on chivalry, it ran on results. If a peasant with a gun could hold a ridge against the finest cavalry in the world, then the gun was the superior tool. He recognized that the age of the individual hero was being replaced by the age of the unit. He saw his arquebusiers not as commoners, but as vital components in a lethal machine. He didn't view his gunners as cowards. He viewed them as assets in a grander calculation. He knew that by placing them behind the trench, he was maximizing their strengths and minimizing their weaknesses. In the open field, the arquebusier was vulnerable during the long reloading process. But behind the dirt, he was safe. Gonzalo was the first to realize that the cheating weapon only worked if you built the right environment for it. He prioritized the efficiency of the bullet over the honor of the blade. He understood that the Spanish crown could afford to lose 1,000 peasants, but the French crown could not afford to lose 1,000 dukes. This was the cold, hard logic of the new era. This brings us to a fundamental question of leadership and legacy. The French chose the path of tradition, believing that the old ways would eventually prevail through sheer conviction. They led with their hearts, and it led them into a ditch. They were fighting for a world that no longer existed, a world of colorful banners and individual glory. The Spanish led with their minds, embracing a dirty, unglamorous technology because it worked. They were fighting for the world that was yet to come, a world of professional armies and nation-states. Before we see the final, horrific collision between these two worlds, I want to ask you something. If you were a commander in 1503, which side would you have chosen to lead? Would you have stood with the French, upholding the 1,000-year tradition of the noble knight and the honor of the blade? Or would you have joined the Spanish, embracing the cold, brutal efficiency of the bullet and the spade? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I'm curious to see where your loyalties lie. Do you value the romantic heritage of the past, or the ruthless pragmatism of the future? The French believed that the soul of war was the man. The Spanish believed the soul of war was the system. And as the French charge hit its peak velocity, the Spanish arquebusiers stood perfectly still. They didn't feel like cheaters. They felt like the executioners of a dying age. They felt the heat of the burning match near their fingers. They felt the grit of the powder on their tongues. They were no longer afraid of the iron giants galloping toward them. They knew that their tubes of iron were the real masters of the field. The Duke of Nemours was now so close that the Spanish could see the individual scales on his horse's armor. He was shouting a battle cry that had echoed through European history for centuries. He was the hero of a story that was about to be rewritten in lead and smoke. He was galloping toward a future he couldn't imagine, at a speed he couldn't stop. The Spanish arquebusiers didn't aim for the man's heart, they aimed for the mass of the charge. They didn't need to be marksmen, they just needed to be a wall. They waited for the signal, their breath held, their eyes fixed on the forest of lances. The technology of death was primed. The match was ready to meet the powder. The French were less than 50 paces away, their horses' hooves throwing up clods of earth that felt like a countdown. And as the first line of gendarmes reached the edge of the ditch, the world held its breath. The knight was about to meet the machine. And the machine was hungry. The air was thick with the scent of anticipation and sweat. The great captain raised his hand. The era of the horse was about to end in a roar of fire. The moment of the great collision was not a sudden explosion, but a crescendo. It began with the rhythmic thud of 4,000 warhorses, a sound that grew from a distant vibration into a roar that swallowed the Italian countryside. The French Duke of Nemours had given the signal. The unstoppable wall was no longer a threat on the horizon, it was a physical weight descending upon the Spanish ridge. This was the moment that centuries of French military doctrine had been building toward, the grand, decisive stroke that would prove, once and for all, that the armored knight was the master of the world. As the French gendarmes accelerated, they entered what modern ballistics would call the kill zone. But to the men of 1503, it was simply a funnel of geography and fate. Gonzalo de Córdoba had positioned his lines with a terrifyingly clear understanding of the sun's path. It was late afternoon, and the sun was dipping toward the horizon directly behind the Spanish ridge. For the French knights, the world was a golden blur. Every time they looked forward to find their target, they were met with a blinding glare reflecting off the Spanish earthworks and the thousands of steel pike tips. The gendarmes were charging uphill, their horses laboring against the incline, their vision compromised by the sunset and the rising dust. They were encased in steel, peering through narrow slits in their helmets, gasping for air as the heat of the afternoon trapped itself inside their plate armor. They were galloping into a void of light. They couldn't see the specific details of the ground ahead, they only saw the Spanish banners at the crest of the hill. They assumed the ground between them and their glory was a flat, unbroken carpet of grass. They were wrong. They were moving at a speed that made correction impossible, driven by the belief that momentum would carry them through any obstacle. Then came the sudden stop. In the history of warfare, momentum is a god. If you can keep 12,000 men and horses moving, they are a force that can break mountains. But if that momentum is interrupted, even for a second, the god dies. The Frenchmen reached the edge of the Spanish trench at full gallop. In the blinding light and the haze of their own dust, the lead riders didn't see the chasm until they were upon it. They had expected a line of men to trample, instead, they found an absence of earth. It wasn't a heroic leap across a gap. It was a catastrophe of physics. The first line of horses tried to flare out, to rein in, or to jump, but the sheer weight of the thousands of riders behind them made a halt impossible. The rear ranks, blinded by the dust and fueled by the adrenaline of the charge, continued to push forward, unaware of the abyss opening up in front of their comrades. The result was a horrific tangle of limbs and steel. Massive destriers, bred for war and laden with armor, plunged into the 6-foot-deep trench, their legs snapping like dry kindling under the weight of the fall. Armored knights were hurled from their saddles, their heavy plate turning them into stones as they hit the bottom of the ditch. In an instant, the shock was gone. The French army didn't crash into the Spanish, they crashed into themselves. The trench became a jagged, thrashing mess of screaming animals and trapped men. The momentum that was supposed to shatter the Spanish line was now being used to crush the French vanguard against the Spanish dirt. The Duke of Nemours, leading from the front, found his horse rearing at the edge of the abyss, his path blocked by the very men he was supposed to lead to victory. The unstoppable wall had become a traffic jam of death. It was a failure of the old world's inability to adapt to the new world's geometry. This was the moment Gonzalo de Córdoba had engineered. The French were stalled. They were clustered together in a dense, immobile mass, trapped between the trench they couldn't cross and the comrades behind them who wouldn't stop pushing. They were no longer a military formation, they were a target. The horses, panicked by the smell of blood and the sound of breaking bones, began to rear and kick, further complicating the efforts of the knights to reorganize. Gonzalo raised his hand. On the ridge, 500 Spanish arquebusiers leaned over the earthen mound. They didn't feel the need for individual heroics. They didn't need to pick out a specific knight or aim for a specific gap in armor. They only had to aim at the center of the iron mass. They were the executioners in a factory of lead. Fire. The Spanish line didn't fire in a disorganized scramble. They fired in coordinated ranks, a tactic that would become the hallmark of the Spanish military for 100 years. The first rank loosed their volleys and immediately knelt to reload, while the second rank stepped forward to deliver the next blow. This was a rhythmic, mechanical process that ensured a constant stream of lead was pouring into the French ranks. There was no reprieve, no moment for the French to catch their breath or mount a counterattack. As the Spanish arquebusiers worked, they entered a state of mechanical trance. This was the drill that Gonzalo had hammered into them for months. The heat from the iron barrels began to blister their fingertips, but they did not flinch. They could hear the lead balls rattling against the inside of the tubes as they rammed them home. Each man was a single piston in a massive, soot-stained engine of war. They weren't looking at the faces of the men they were killing. The thick, acrid smoke from the first few volleys had created a physical curtain between the ridge and the valley. They were firing into a gray void, guided only by the sound of the French screaming and the glint of steel through the haze. The sound was a singular, thunderous boom that rattled the bones of every man on that hill. A massive cloud of white, sulphurous smoke erupted from the Spanish line, momentarily veiling the ridge and turning the sun into a pale, ghostly disk. But beneath that smoke, the lead was doing its work. At 50 paces, the arquebus was devastating. The heavy lead balls, soft and expanding on impact, tore through the expensive French plate armor as if it were parchment. They shredded the silk surcoats of the nobility. They pulped the chests of the horses. Because the French were so tightly packed together, a single ball could often pass through one man and into the next, maximizing the lethality of every shot. The smoke began to drift away on the afternoon breeze, and the reality of the ridge was revealed. It was a vision of absolute carnage. The space in front of the Spanish trench was no longer a field, it was a wall of the dead. Horses lay in grotesque heaps, their legs still twitching in the dirt, their screams a high-pitched counterpoint to the deep roar of the guns. Noblemen, men whose families had ruled provinces for centuries, lay in the muck, their gilded armor stained with blood and soil. The unstoppable wall had been converted into a literal barricade of corpses that now served as an additional fortification for the Spanish. The French survivors were in shock. They had never seen death on this scale, delivered with such mechanical coldness. They were used to the fair exchange of the blade, the back and forth of the melee where skill and courage might save a man. They were not prepared for a war where the enemy simply stood behind a pile of dirt and erased you from existence without ever having to look you in the eye. It was a psychological breakdown as much as a physical one. Their world was being unmade by lead. This wall of smoke served a dual purpose. For the Spanish, it provided a psychological shield, distancing them from the visceral horror of the slaughter they were conducting. For the French, it was a terrifying mystery. They were charging into a cloud that spat fire and lead, unable to see their executioners. Every time a French knight tried to rally his comrades, a fresh flash of light from the ridge would silence him. The coordination of the Spanish volleys meant that there were no gaps in the fire, no moment of safety where a leader could regain control. Nemours tried to rally his men through the chaos. He screamed for the infantry to come forward, for the Swiss mercenaries to bridge the gap with their own bodies. But the coordination was gone. The French command structure had been decapitated in the first few volleys as officers were picked off by Spanish sharpshooters. The knights who remained were trapped in a cycle of panic, their horses refusing to move forward over the bodies of their kind. The élan of the French had been replaced by the nausea of the trap. The Spanish arquebusiers didn't stop. They continued their rhythmic, industrial reload. Pour the powder. Ram the ball. Prime the pan. Blow the match. Each cycle took lives. Each cycle deepened the wall of dead. The Spanish pikemen stood behind the gunners, their steel points lowered, a secondary barrier of iron that the French couldn't even reach. They were the silent watchers of the massacre, waiting for any knight who might crawl out of the ditch. This was the funnel of fire. Gonzalo had taken the greatest strength of the French, their numbers and their aggression, and used it to destroy them. By forcing them into a narrow space where they couldn't maneuver, he had ensured that every Spanish shot found a home. He had turned the battlefield into a factory of slaughter. The efficiency was terrifying. It was a rejection of the romanticized combat of the past in favor of the brutal pragmatism of the future. The air was now so thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood that men were gagging. The screams of the wounded horses were a constant, haunting backdrop to the rhythmic booms of the guns. The sun continued to sink, casting long, distorted shadows over the massacre, making the field look like a vision of the underworld. To the French, it must have felt like the end of the world. Their entire social order, their entire way of being, was being dismantled by commoners they couldn't even see through the smoke. Louis d'Armagnac, the Duke of Nemours, looked around him at the ruins of his dream. He saw his friends, his cousins, and his knights dying in the dirt. He realized that the glory he had sought was a lie. There was no glory in a trench. There was only physics, lead, and the cold calculation of a man who didn't care about his name. But even in this moment of total failure, the Duke was a prisoner of his past. He couldn't retreat. He couldn't admit that he had been outthought by a man with a spade. He spurred his horse one last time, trying to find a gap in the Spanish line, trying to find a way to reach Gonzalo and settle this with steel. He was looking for a heroic conclusion to a story that had already become a tragedy. He rode directly into the smoke. He was the last representative of a dying age, charging into the mouth of a future that didn't want him. On the ridge, a Spanish gunner saw the flash of gold and the ostrich plumes of the Duke's helmet through the haze. He didn't know he was looking at the commander of the French army. He only saw a target. He lowered his match to the pan. The explosion was the final punctuation mark of the charge. The Duke of Nemours was hit by 3 separate lead balls. He didn't have time for a final speech or a heroic gesture. He simply fell from his horse and disappeared into the muck of the ditch, his gilded armor disappearing beneath the bodies of his own men. The heart of the French army had just stopped beating. The charge was over. The funnel of fire had done its work. The Spanish soldiers, weary and covered in soot, looked out over the ridge. They didn't see heroes, they saw the wreckage of a world they had just destroyed. They saw the end of the night and the beginning of the soldier. The silence that followed the final volley was heavier than the noise of the battle. It was the silence of a grave. The French knights had come to Cerignola to reaffirm their dominance. Instead, they had become the foundation of a new kind of power. The ground was no longer vibrating. The roar of the horses had been replaced by the crackle of the lingering fires and the quiet moans of the dying. The Spanish had held the ridge. They had held the future. And they had done it without losing a single inch of dirt. The funnel of fire was now a self-sustaining cycle. The more the French pushed, the more they died, and the more their bodies blocked the path for those behind them. The very concept of valor had been turned against them. By the time the sun touched the horizon, the French army was no longer a military force, it was a heap of broken pride and shattered steel. The great captain stood atop the mound, his silhouette sharp against the fading light, watching as the era of the night was ground into the Italian soil. As the last light of the sun vanished, the Spanish army began to move. But they weren't retreating. They were preparing for the final phase of the great captain's plan. The funnel of fire was about to become a pursuit. The Middle Ages were officially over, buried in a trench in southern Italy, covered in the lead of a peasant's gun. The world would never be the same. The great captain had not just won a battle, he had ended an epoch. The fall of a world often begins with the fall of a single man. In the high-stakes theater of 16th-century Italy, that man was Louis d'Armagnac, the Duke of Nemours. He was the sun around which the French army orbited, a figure of such immense social and military gravity that his presence alone sustained the momentum of the charge. He was the living embodiment of the spirit the French believed was their birthright. But as the funnel of fire reached its peak, that sun was abruptly snuffed out, leaving his army in a cold, dark void of confusion. The Duke's death was not the poetic, choreographed duel that the troubadours of the era loved to describe in their epic poems. There was no exchange of noble challenges, no clashing of swords between two equal lords on a field of honor. Instead, it was a moment of cold, mechanical finality. The Duke's death was the ultimate proof of the arquebus' cold, unfeeling power. The effect on the French army was instantaneous and catastrophic. In the medieval mindset, the leader was the soul of the host. Without the Duke, the invincibility of the gendarmes didn't just crack, it shattered. The knights who had been pushing forward suddenly found themselves paralyzed. The commands stopped. The banners wavered. The momentum that had carried them across the valley was replaced by a hollow, gnawing dread. They realized that if their duke could be killed so easily, so ignobly, then none of them were safe. The social contract of the battlefield, the idea that nobility afforded protection, had been liquidated in a single blast of powder. They stood there, horses milling in the dust, looking for a leader who was no longer there. The French infantry, arriving behind the stalled cavalry, saw the empty saddle and the riderless horse of their commander. The rumor of his death spread like a fever through the ranks. "The Duke is down," was the cry that broke the back of the French spirit. The iron wall of the French gendarmes, once a singular and terrifying machine, was now just a collection of confused, terrified men looking for an exit. This was the moment Gonzalo de Córdoba had been waiting for. He saw the French lines falter. He saw the hesitation in the way they held their lances. He knew the machine had done its work, now it was time for the blade. He raised his hand, giving the signal that would turn a defeat into a massacre. Advance. From the gaps in the Spanish line, a new kind of horror emerged. These were the rodoleros, the shield-bearers. These men were the survivors of the brutal fighting of the Reconquista, specialists in close-quarter slaughter. They carried small, round steel bucklers and short, razor-sharp swords. They didn't march in slow, rhythmic blocks like the pikemen. They moved with the predatory agility of wolves, sliding over the earthworks and descending into the trench. They didn't wait for the French to climb out of the ditch. They jumped into it. The scene that followed was the antithesis of chivalry. The French gendarmes, trapped in the trench, were at a total disadvantage. Their long lances were useless in the cramped, muddy confines of the ditch. Their heavy plate armor, designed to deflect blows from above while on horseback, became a tomb. Once a knight was knocked into the mud, the weight of his steel made it nearly impossible to stand back up. He became a turtle flipped on its back, thrashing in the sludge, unable to find leverage against the Spanish blades. The rodoleros didn't offer mercy, and they didn't ask for ransoms. They moved through the trench with industrial efficiency, their bucklers clanging against the expensive plate of the French. They used their shields to pin a knight's arm or head against the earth, then used their short swords to find the gaps that the arquebus had ignored. They drove their blades through visor slits, under armpits, and into the soft tissue of the throat. It was a visceral, silent kind of violence, punctuated only by the wet sound of steel meeting flesh and the muffled cries of men who couldn't breathe under the weight of their own protection. This was the true climax of the battle. It was the point where the technological superiority of the Spanish gave way to raw, primal aggression. The Spanish infantrymen were venting decades of frustration against an aristocratic class that had looked down upon them for centuries. They dragged the lords of France into the dirt and executed them in the shadows of the trench. There was no glory here, only the grim reality of the footman's reprisal. The trench was filled with the metallic scent of blood and the heavy, earthy smell of the disturbed soil. The French infantry, seeing their noble leaders being systematically butchered in the ditch, began to break. The Swiss mercenaries, usually the most disciplined troops in Europe, looked at the wall of dead horses and the carnage in the trench and realized the day was lost. They began a fighting retreat, but even they couldn't ignore the scale of the disaster. The French army was no longer a cohesive unit, it was a collection of individuals trying to escape a slaughter pen. They were fleeing the future, a future where their skill and their bloodlines were no longer enough to save them. By the time the rodoleros climbed back out of the ditch, their armor was coated in the blood and mud of the French nobility. The unstoppable wall had been reduced to a heap of scrap metal and cooling flesh. The Duke of Nemours lay at the bottom of it all, his body unrecognizable beneath the weight of the chaos he had unleashed. His ostrich plumes were trodden into the muck, a final symbol of the old world's vanity. This was the true end of chivalric warfare. The idea of the noble duel was dead. The idea that a man's status protected him from the lowly foot soldier was dead. Gonzalo de Córdoba had not just defeated an army, he had destroyed a philosophy. He had proven that a professional infantry, supported by technology and field engineering, could dismantle the most elite social class in Europe without breaking a sweat. He had turned the battlefield into a place of logic and geometry, where the man who dug the best ditch and fired the best gun was the only one who survived. As the Spanish soldiers stood over the trench, looking down at the wreckage, the silence of the evening returned. The screams had faded into moans. The smoke of the guns had thinned to a bitter haze that hung over the bodies. The sun had finally vanished, leaving the field in a cold, blue twilight that made the steel of the fallen look like ice. The Spanish had not just held the ridge, they had occupied the future. They were no longer the underdogs of the Mediterranean, they were the new masters of the world. The death of the Duke was the final punctuation mark of the era. He had lived as a symbol of the old world, and he had died as a victim of the new one. His gilded armor, once a sign of his divine right to lead, was now just an obstacle for the looters who would soon roam the field. The gendarmes were gone. The masters of the horse had been grounded forever. Gonzalo de Córdoba walked to the edge of the trench and looked down. He didn't gloat, and he didn't offer a prayer. He simply observed the results of his calculations. The ditch was full. The enemy was broken. The system had worked. He looked at the nameless soldier who had fired the shot that killed the Duke and gave him a nod of acknowledgement. It was the only reward the new era offered, survival. The struggle had finished its work, and the world that emerged from that trench would never look the same. The age of the knight had ended not with a whimper, but with the wet thud of a body in the mud and the cold, sharp bite of a Spanish blade. The ridge of Cerignola was now a monument to the power of the ditch and the bullet. Gonzalo's victory was absolute. In less than an hour, the Spanish had decimated the pride of France while suffering almost no losses of their own. This wasn't a battle of attrition, it was an execution of a tactical concept. The Duke of Nemours had come seeking a pageant of chivalry, but Gonzalo de Córdoba had given him a demonstration of modern lethality. As the Spanish began to gather their equipment and tend to their few wounded, the realization of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They had not just won a skirmish in an Italian war, they had shifted the axis of history. The trench, the arquebus, and the pike had combined to create a force that would dominate the next century. The Duke of Nemours lay dead, but the great captain was just beginning his ascent. The dawn following the Battle of Cerignola did not just reveal a battlefield, it revealed a new world order. As the morning mist pulled away from the vine-covered ridge, the true scale of the Spanish achievement began to take shape. It was a sight that defied the military logic of the age. On one side of the ledger stood the French army, the most expensive, most elite force in Christendom, now reduced to heaps of broken steel and silent riders. On the other stood the Spanish, weary but nearly intact. The tally was more than a victory, it was a statistical impossibility by the standards of the time. History records that over 3,000 French soldiers, the majority of them high-born gendarmes and professional Swiss infantry, lay dead on the field. This number did not include the thousands more who were captured or scattered during the pursuit. And the Spanish price for this total annihilation? Less than 100 men. Let that ratio sink in. In an era where battles were typically grinding affairs of attrition, Gonzalo de Córdoba had achieved a 30-to-1 kill ratio. This wasn't a fight, it was a paradigm shift. The disproportionate nature of the casualties sent a shockwave through the palaces of Europe. It signaled that the old calculus of war, where victory was bought with the blood of thousands in a chaotic melee, was over. A new, clinical era of warfare had arrived, and Spain was its sole practitioner. This victory at Cerignola marks the official beginning of what historians call the Spanish century. For the next 100 years, the Spanish infantry would be the undisputed masters of the European continent. From the fields of Italy to the marshes of the Netherlands, the Spanish presence would become synonymous with invincibility. But this dominance didn't happen by accident, nor was it fueled by a sudden surge in the Spanish population. It was born on this ridge, in the synthesis of the pike, the gun, and the ditch. It was here that the tercio was born. Although the formal name would come later, the DNA of the tercio, the legendary Spanish square, was perfected at Cerignola. Gonzalo de Córdoba had proven that a professional, permanent infantry force could overcome any obstacle if it was organized into a self-sustaining system. The tercio was a living fortress. It was a formation that integrated diverse weapons into a singular, flexible organism. It had the defensive reach of the pike, the offensive lethality of the arquebus, and the close-quarter savagery of the sword. It was the world's first modern military unit, and it would remain unbeaten for generations. The global shift was profound. Before Cerignola, Spain was a rising power, but one still largely focused on its own peninsula. After Cerignola, Spain became the world's first hyperpower. This victory secured Spanish control over Naples and southern Italy, providing the Mediterranean base from which they would project power across the globe. The wealth of the New World was soon to follow, but it was the military system forged by the great captain that allowed Spain to hold and defend an empire on which the sun never set. They didn't just have more gold, they had a better way of fighting. This brings us to the most vital lesson of the Battle of Cerignola, the triumph of systems over individuals. The medieval world was built on the great man theory of combat. The knight was an individual hero, a man whose prowess was determined by his personal strength and his noble lineage. The French lost at Cerignola because they relied on 4,000 individual heroes charging as a disorganized mass. They were a collection of parts, not a machine. The French had the better armor, the more expensive horses, and the more prestigious titles. They had the weight of tradition on their side. But the Spanish had the system. They had the great captain, a man who looked at a battlefield not as a place for glory, but as a problem to be solved. He solved it with dirt and lead, and in doing so, he gave his nation a century of dominance. Gonzalo's reforms went beyond the battlefield. To sustain the system he demonstrated at Cerignola, he had to reinvent the very idea of a soldier. Before his time, armies were often temporary collections of feudal levies or unreliable mercenaries. Gonzalo pushed for the creation of a standing, professional force, men who were paid regularly, trained constantly, and held to a rigorous code of discipline. This was a revolutionary concept. It meant that the Spanish army didn't dissolve after a campaign. It became a permanent institution, a repository of experience and tactical knowledge that grew with every battle. This professionalization led to the tercio structure, a division of roughly 3,000 men. The brilliance of the tercio was its versatility. It was large enough to hold a position against a massive army, yet small enough to be nimble. It was an administrative masterpiece as much as a tactical one, with a clear hierarchy of officers who were promoted based on merit rather than birthright. This was the final nail in the coffin of the feudal system. In the Spanish army, a man's rank was determined by his ability to manage the machine, not the coat of arms he inherited. The geopolitical ripple effect of Cerignola was immediate. Italy, the cultural and economic heart of Europe, became the playground of the Spanish crown. The French, who had dominated Italian politics for a generation, were pushed back. The papacy, always a fickle ally, realized that the Spanish were now the only force capable of providing stability in the peninsula. This shift in power wasn't just local, it changed the balance of the entire continent. It allowed the Habsburg dynasty to consolidate power, eventually leading to the massive empire of Charles V. All of this can be traced back to that single morning on the ridge. The Spanish century was not a product of luck, it was a product of the iron mind of the great captain and the willingness of the Spanish state to embrace a new way of being. They realized that in the modern world, power belongs to those who can organize. The gendarmes were the last great expression of individual power, the tercio was the first great expression of collective power. To truly grasp the significance of this moment, one must look at the economic reality of the 1500s. War was becoming prohibitively expensive. The French model of the high-born knight was no longer sustainable against a model that produced more kills for less gold. Gonzalo de Córdoba didn't just outfight the French, he outspent them by making their expensive nobility irrelevant. He proved that the future belonged to the state that could industrialize its defense. The world's first hyperpower was not built on the number of its men, but on the quality of its systems. It was built on the realization that a well-placed ditch and a well-drilled line of gunners could defeat any amount of noble courage. It was a victory of the mind over the heart, of the future over the past. And as the Spanish soldiers looked out over the Mediterranean from the heights of Naples, they knew that the world was theirs to command. The legacy of Cerignola is the legacy of the professional. It is the story of how a small group of focused, disciplined people can dismantle an empire of tradition if they have a better system. It is a warning to every leader who believes that status is a substitute for strategy. The Spanish hyperpower was born in the mud of a trench, but it reached for the stars. It showed that innovation is the only true defense against obsolescence. It teaches us that the most dangerous thing an empire can do is become a prisoner of its own past successes. The French thought they were invincible because they had always been invincible. They viewed their history as a shield. The Spanish became invincible because they knew they weren't. They viewed their history as a lesson to be analyzed and improved upon. They didn't worship the charge, they studied the impact. They didn't pray for a hero, they engineered a formation. Gonzalo de Córdoba had built more than a trench, he had built the foundation of an empire. He had shown that the spade and the bullet were the true heirs to the lance and the sword. And as the Spanish flags were raised over the fortress of Cerignola, the message was clear to every king and duke in Europe: the rules of the game have changed. Adapt, or find your own place in the ditch. The Spanish century had begun. It wasn't fueled by the brilliance of a single charge or the luck of a single day. It was fueled by the cold, hard efficiency of a system that had been tested in the fires of southern Italy and found to be unbreakable. The hyperpower was born, and the world would spend the next 100 years trying to figure out how to survive it. This was the moment Spain stopped being a collection of kingdoms and started being a global machine. The ridge at Cerignola is quiet now. The vineyards still cling to the slopes of the Apulian hills, and the Mediterranean sun still bakes the soil into a pale, dusty yellow. To a casual traveler, it is just another piece of the Italian landscape, a peaceful stretch of earth unremarkable in its beauty. But for those who know the language of the past, this ground vibrates with the echo of a massive tectonic shift. It is the site of a funeral, not for a man, or even an army, but for a way of life. The rider died at Cerignola. When we speak of the rider, we are talking about the armored knight, the gendarme, the nobleman on horseback who had served as the structural pillar of European civilization for over 1,000 years. Since the days of Charlemagne, the knight had been the judge, the jury, and the executioner of the battlefield. He was the center of the economy, the hero of the literature, and the architect of the social order. He believed his position was divine, his armor was impenetrable, and his charge was irresistible. But on April 28, 1503, that 1,000-year-old myth ran into a ditch. The modern world was born in that furrowed earth. It wasn't born with a grand proclamation or a noble treaty. It was born in the sulphurous cloud of an arquebus blast and the cold, sharp efficiency of a spade. When the Duke of Nemours fell into the mud, he wasn't just losing a battle, he was witnessing the collapse of the feudal world. The ridge of Cerignola proved that a system built on individual heritage and traditional valor could no longer survive against a system built on industrial logic, field engineering, and the professionalization of the common man. This is the great, uncomfortable truth of our history: the future does not belong to the most valiant, the most honorable, or the most storied. It belongs to the most adaptive. The French were the masters of the charge, a tactic that had worked for centuries. They were so successful at it that they stopped looking for ways to improve. They became prisoners of their own excellence. They mistook their past victories for a permanent law of nature. They arrived at Cerignola expecting to play a game whose rules had already been rewritten by a man who refused to be a prisoner of tradition.